Beliefs about vampires, werewolves, witches, and wizards are widespread.
Exactly what is a serial killer?
Our house was 2 rooms, and there was 7 of us.
He held the bat like this.
That's why I have characters who sort of expose themselves.
And everybody always said, Coach Carter, Samuel Jackson is taller than you. I said, I know, but I think I'm better looking.
Very happy to be here. This has been a long time coming, this conversation. So before I start, I want to kind of give a brief background of how we got here, literally me here standing on this stage. The genealogy and the descendant aspect I'll get into in the presentation, but around February of 2021, there was a lot going on. We were a year past George Floyd. There was a lot of conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I really became deeply fascinated with how public colleges and universities in Louisiana integrated. Because I'm in the firm belief that how an institution desegregated and integrated very much informs their approach and their stance towards race, diversity, all of those things currently. And so I'd always heard, and I'll get into this more later, I'd always heard stories about my grandmother, who you will meet, and her participation and involvement in the desegregation of Southeastern. And so I want to give some thanks to a couple of people before I begin. First would be Dr. Keith Finley in the Department of History, because I emailed him and said, hey, I'm trying to find information. I don't know where to start. All I have are these sort of disparate pieces. And he really sent me on a journey and gave me all the information he had. And at the end of the conversation, he thanked me. And he said, thank you for picking this up. This is something that has been important to me. You can see it in my work. But there's something about the way that you talk about this that I know that you're not going to let this go. And so fast forward to the end of 2021, I get this email from a history student named Max Hopcraft. And he says, hi, I'm Max. I'm in history for something something. And I want to do this project on the desegregation of Southeastern, because I realized that the university was in the midst of rebranding. And when I went to the About section, it didn't mention anything about Black people. How can you rebrand the university and talk about its history and legacy? And in the most pivotal part that explains the foundation of who we are as Southeastern, it completely erases Black history. So he said, I heard from Dr. Finley that you're passionate about this, so would you mind working with me? And so what you see, a lot of the historical documents and the legal artifacts, that was Max. That was, I would have conversations, we set up a Google Drive, we would chat in the Google Drive, and he'd say, I found this. And through that, this evolved. So I always like to manage expectations before I talk. That's the speech teacher in me. So I want you to know this is not a lecture, this is a conversation. I am not a history teacher, I'm a communicator, therefore I'm a storyteller. And this is a story. Change is relational and rarely immediate. The way that change happens the most is through relationships, and relationships form through stories. This is not the story of Southeastern, but it is a story of Southeastern. It's my story, it's my parents' story, it's my grandmother's story, it's my kids' story, but it's also the story of Black history of Southeastern. Therefore, it is the history of Southeastern. And so as you hear me speak, there may be things that you don't know. That's fine. I encourage you to write them down and look them up. That's the teacher in me. If there's something you don't know, if there's an event you've never heard of, if there's a term you've never heard, write it down, look it up. If things make you uncomfortable, and they might, that's okay. I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to encourage you to think. Because the danger of a single story is that the one who creates the story creates the world that we live in. The power of collaborative stories is that we all get to participate. And so it is incumbent upon all of us to bring our stories with us. And that's what I want to do today. So this story, this is my grandmother. This is Mary Ann Lowe. She was born to James Lowe, affectionately known as Papa Jim, who worked the railroads and was a farmer, and Elizabeth Lowe, who I'm named after, called Lizzie Lowe, and Big Mama, who was a homemaker because she had 10 children, of which my grandmother was number nine. My Big Mama only had a second grade education, but even with that, she was able to help her daughter enter Southeastern. And also, I most recently found out, she figured out a way to keep the land that was in their family in the family. With a second grade education in Louisiana, in Ponchatoula, Louisiana, she figured out a way. This is the legacy that I come from, which makes a whole lot of sense now that I know it. This is Mary Ann Lowe. She is one of the 12 and or 13, there's discrepancy on the number, students who are accredited with Desegregating Southeastern. And what I will go through decade by decade is Mary Ann's story. There will be times that Mary Ann and her family are present in the narrative. There are times where I'll discuss what is happening nationally. There'll be times that I'll be discussing what is happening in the state. Politically, there'll be times when I'm discussing specifically what's happening at Southeastern. But at all times, Mary Ann's legacy is present in the story. So let's get started. 1950 to 1959. If you know anything about history, a lot of stuff was popping up in 1950. This is Greenville Park High School. It was the school that if you were black, you went to. It is the school that my grandmother went to. It is the school, if I'm not mistaken, that she met my grandfather at. And it was in the spring of 1954 that she was graduating from this school that the NAACP reached out to the community to find 12 or 13 willing participants to start the process of desegregating what was then known as Southeastern Louisiana College. Politically, a lot was going on. We were in the midst of Brown versus Board, which wouldn't be decided until May of '54. But before that, there had been several court cases that had litigated black people's ability to attend higher education. So you had Missouri versus Canada, you had SIPUL versus the Board of Regents, you had Sweat versus Painter. You had all of this was setting the stage for what the NAACP was planning. So there are a couple of different accounts of how the first black students attempted to enroll in Southeastern. So one account is actually found in the newspaper. It is called the Evening Star, and it reported and it's very tiny, you can kind of see it, it's college turns 12 away. And it says that in Hammond, Louisiana, Southeastern Louisiana College turned away 12 Negroes who attempted to register for the fall term. President Luther Dyson, as in the building, cited Louisiana segregation laws which had not been subjected to surveillance by the courts. The dean, J.B. Woolley, said, "Of course we had to turn them down," end quote. So that's one account of happened. President Luther Dyson, who was the president of Southeastern at the time, also has an official account in a letter that he sent to W.C. Peralt, who was the Attorney General at the time. And then he has a more colorful account in a memoir that he authored in 1995. I want to read you a brief excerpt from that. He says that blacks first attempted to register at Southeastern for the fall semester on September 9th, 1954. I received a call at my home about 6 o'clock in the morning on this day, and a female voice said, "Them colored folks are planning to come out there and get in your school today, and I wanted you to know." Although I did not recognize the voice, I thanked her for the information, and she hung up the phone. At about 2 o'clock on the 9th of September, 13 black students, again, discrepancies, 13 black students got in line in front of the registrar's office in McGehee Hall to get their cards for registration. They were accompanied by 4 adults. He goes on to say that he names who the adults were, And he said that he invited the 4 adults into his office, at which the time was in McGehee Hall, just across from the registrar's office. And I informed them that it was contrary to the law under which the college was established to admit blacks. This is important. I showed them a certified copy of the act establishing Southeastern for the education of the white race. So he goes on and talks about how they were polite and courteous, but he was like, this is great, but it's not happening for you today. But what he also recounts is that the 4 adults who were with them, attorneys, he says a newspaper man, and a local man from the community said, that's fine. We understand that we're not going to be admitted today. You have to deny us in order for us to move forward. Now, another account of this story comes from my grandmother. And in 2020, my father sat down with my grandmother and asked her about her experience. And she talks about how there was a NAACP meeting at the end of the spring semester, and she said she didn't go to the meeting, but Big Mama did, and they told them that they wanted these students to go to Southeastern with the NAACP, and that they knew they were going to be turned away, but they needed them to go and try to enroll. And according to my grandmother's account, she didn't really understand the whole ramification. They didn't really explain much except for, much like parents do, be here at this time, do this, and if they tell you to leave, go home. What my grandmother does say is she does remember coming to campus. She does remember them saying, specifically, we don't allow colored people here. She remembers them waiting. And she remembers the adults going to meet with the president, and essentially they all got sent home. They came back to campus, and they said, you're not registering today. They took their names and their information, and then they left. What we do know is that on September 20th, 1954, President Dyson sends a letter to the Assistant Attorney General detailing the events of the campus. And at that time, the 13th name is added. These documents are really important because they put names to the bodies that did the work that allowed me to be in this room, that allowed many of you to be in this room. For a long time, the newspaper coverage only referred to them as the 12 Negroes or the 13 Negroes. But thanks to the court documents, which are at Tulane, we now know that the 12 plaintiffs in the case of Thomas C. Wells et al. Versus Luther Dyson, president, C.J. Hyde, registrar, Southeastern Louisiana College, and the Louisiana State Board of Education are as follows. Thomas C. Wells, Jeanette Jordan, Margaret Jones, Norma Love, Mildred Crawford, Mrs. Alma L. Clark, Myrtle Cook, Betty Jean Lewis, Marianne Lowe, Doris Jennings, and Bertha Jennings. So what happens? The NAACP Thoreau files a lawsuit against Southeastern, alleging that it is discriminatory for them not to be allowed to enroll. Now, of course, there's going to be some pushback. If you know your Louisiana history, you know this is Senator Willie Rannoch, a known segregationist. What you see at the bottom is what he platformed on in his campaign for governor in 1959. If you can't read it, let me read it. Our forefathers won freedom with bullets. We must protect it with our ballots for states' rights, segregation, honesty, and economy. Senator Rannoch could not conceive of a world that schools were desegregated. So much so that in 1954, he began to put the legal wheels in place to create a series of acts to circumvent any federal legislation. At this point, Brown versus Board happened. At this point, it is the rule of the land. But what does racism do? It finds ways to entrench itself in other places. So Senator Rannoch begins to conceive of these acts and these bills that essentially comply with the law, but in a very roundabout way. Most specifically, he starts to conceive of what eventually becomes Act 16 and 15, which requires certain documentation for black people to be enrolled, but then creates circumstances where it's almost impossible for black people to get that documentation to get in. In April of 1955, the federal court rules in favor of the plaintiffs in the Wells lawsuit. And in the summer semester of 1955, my grandmother and 18 other students enroll into what is Southeastern Louisiana College. But here's the thing. Not long after, at the beginning of 1956, in the summer of 1956, the Louisiana House passes Act 15 and 16. Act 15 of the Louisiana legislature requires certificates of eligibility for students, and it not only required an academic record, but it required an account from a guidance counselor attesting to their good character. But that's not the end of Act 15. The tail end of Act 15 made it illegal for any white guidance counselor to actually issue a certificate of eligibility to any black student, essentially constraining any black student from being admitted. Because at this point, they only accepted the certificates of eligibility from white guidance counselors. How does this affect the students at Southeastern? Well, let's go back to our lovely Senator Willie Rannoch. Senator Willie Rannoch did not only want to prevent future black students from attending, he wanted Act 15 and 16 to be retroactive. None of the students who were admitted at what is now UL Lafayette, Southwestern Louisiana College, and none of the students at Southeastern were required to have these COEs. What Senator Rannoch fought for was for the COEs to be retroactive. And all of the, at the time, I think 300 students who had been admitted were now scrambling to find white guidance counselors to write these certificates of eligibility so that they could remain enrolled. So what happens? And this is from CJ Hyde, our registrar. That is at the top. It says that you must have this to be able to be enrolled. This is Mildred Myers Crawford, who is one of the plaintiffs, writing to the superintendent basically saying, I don't know what to do. I have attended Southeastern, now I'm getting this letter back saying I have to get this, I can't get it. So she is imploring the superintendent, asking them what to do. Well, as you can imagine, she doesn't get much help. So she then writes A.P. Thoreau, who helped litigate the case to desegregate the school, and says, again, I don't know what to do. Respectfully, this woman is pleading because what we don't talk about is that all of this is happening still in a very much segregated South. All of this is still happening very much in a Jim Crow Louisiana. All of these students are, in essence, risking their lives to attend school. And their accounts of school, okay, so yes, you can come to school, but whites and blacks can't sit in class together, so doors were locked. They listened to lectures from the outside. There were no white and colored bathrooms at Southeastern because there were no colored people. So where were they going to the bathroom? They were not allowed to attend public events. So yes, we can enroll you. They didn't give them books. Everything was different for them. So they're finally here. They're finally making it. And here comes another challenge that these poor people are imploring for any assistance possible, and they're met with nothing. So what ends up happening, which is something that is you'll see throughout the decades, is that it gets relitigated. So in 1957, A.P. Thoreau files Alma Lark versus Louisiana State Board of Education, challenging all the acts. And through a series of events that doesn't get settled until 1958, it goes back and forth, gets sent to an appellate court, comes back, turns back around, and finally the acts are ruled as discriminatory. It's not lost on me that in 1959, Mildred Miles Crawford graduates with a bachelor's degree in elementary education from Southeastern. Luther Dyson, in his memoir, recounts this time with some interesting memory, and I want to share some of that with you. He says, as I look back over my years at Southeastern, I believe that racial integration of the college was one of the experiences which I approached with the most apprehension and uncertainty. Remember these words. He goes on to say that while he understands that it's the rule of the law, he still believed that it was gone about the wrong way. His own desegregation plan included starting with first grade and desegregating grades incrementally until eventually you got to college. But he says, I made a statement which I still believe today, and that was to the effect that no special privileges were to be accorded to the black students. They were either to perform the work of college caliber or be dismissed from the roles of college, as was the case with white students. I was determined that integration would not weaken the academic standards of Southeastern. He goes on to write that he goes on to commend the faculty and staff of their treatment of the black students, and he believes that the successful integration of Southeastern were for the following reasons. The faculty and students have been prepared for integration, and they treated black students fairly without making concessions. The college was fortunate that for some years following 1955, the number of blacks was relatively small, and the fact that most blacks who did enroll were genuinely interested in trying to get an education and not simply there to be a disruptive force. This was the Southeastern that the initial black students toiled under, an expectation that that the possibility of them being on campus would weaken the academic standard of the university, that the only reason that they wanted to come to Southeastern was to be disruptive, and thank God there was only a few of them. Sentiments that carried through the next several decades. So now we move to the 1960s. A lot of stuff happened from 1960 and 1969. Not much of a record of it for Southeastern. Lots of missing faculty minutes, lots of missing files. But as you can see, nationally, lots of things were going on. We do have one account, thank you to Dr. Selena Eccles, who wrote a paper about diversity in the late 90s. She gives an account of Celine Short, who was at Southeastern in 1966. Celine says, I remember once we attended an SLU football game. All blacks had to sit on the sideline of the football field. We couldn't sit with whites because of a rule prohibiting blacks and whites from sitting together at public events. Ned McGee was the athletic director at the time. By the time we were seated, an announcement came over the intercom announcing the license plate of the car we were driving. Someone had set the car on fire. If you were black, you really didn't have anyone to talk to. This really interfered with your sense of self. When you attended class, they, meaning the white people, would vacate seats to your immediate north, south, east, and west unless the professor alphabetized names according to the seats. It was left up to the instructor, if he didn't want you to feel isolated, to alphabetize seats according to names. Being at SLU was not a happy time. Our parents were the only ones who understood that what we were going through. Daddy gave us courage by saying, you can either go to school or push a wheelbarrow. That's what black folks working on the railroads could often be seen doing. We wanted to do more than push a wheelbarrow. Even though it hurts to talk about it, young students who don't want to hear about what happened troubles me. I'm afraid that if they don't know their past, history can be repeated. This was her account of 1966. In 1969, the Department of Education and Welfare, which was called HUE, began examining states to see if they were actually operating under Brown versus Board in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, more specifically Title VI. Shocker, what they found is that 10 states, predominantly found in the South, were not. And this opens what will be a decades-long fight, legal fight, to make true and meaningful moves towards desegregation and integration of schools in Louisiana. So now we get to the 1970s. In the 1970s, the NAACP, on behalf of the taxpayers of Louisiana, filed a suit against the Office of Civil Rights for failure to cut off funding for states who were in violation of Act 6. This is important because it sets up a series of forthcoming consent decrees that essentially force Louisiana public higher education institutions to do the right thing by black people. In 1973, the court found in favor of the NAACP, and not unsignificantly, in 1973, SLU hired its first full-time black faculty member. What is happening in the world of Mary Lowe is that her son, in 1972, is at Ponchatoula High School, and he is selected to, I want to read it, to participate in the Student Advisory Council promoting understanding among students and school staff in desegregation and goodwill between the races. That's my dad. So in 1972, he is on a committee, essentially a diversity committee, to help work with, I come by it honest, huh? He's in a diversity committee to help foster community and collaboration as the schools are desegregating. In New Orleans, at John F. Kennedy High, is his future wife, Deborah Williamson, who is also, by default, desegregating the band. My mother was an archer. She was a gymnast. She was a cheerleader. And all of this leads them to enter Southeastern in 1974 as music education majors, where they meet in the halls of Pottle and fall in love. While my mother plays flute and my dad plays saxophone. My dad was in, I want to get this right, Phi Mu Alpha Symphonium. He was in the marching band. He was in symphonic band. He was in Student of the States, and he was in the jazz band. My mother was in the marching band and symphonic band, but more importantly, my mother was ROTC. Her sophomore year, she joined ROTC, and she was in a group called the Colonel's Pride, which was for women in the military and ROTC. She was one of the few black women in that group. And not insignificantly, as more black women began to be involved in the group was shut down. So, and it does not exist. So my parents were at Southeastern from 1974 to 1979. In 1975, a piece of Southeastern history, the Kappa Nu chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity was first chartered. And in 1979, my parents got married, finished their degrees. The Department of Education was created in 1979 and took up the court case that Southeastern was still in. And in 1979, my parents moved to Nashville, Tennessee, or to Tennessee, because my mother was in the military. She was commissioned and then sent to Tennessee. So the Lowe family journey takes a pause for a couple of decades, but I'm going to still tell you what was going on. So in 1980 to 1989, my parents had my first 5 sisters, Elizabeth, Stephanie, Sarah, Cheryl, and Michelle, were all born in Nashville during this time period. This is my mother, who was wearing one of the first maternity military uniforms because she was pregnant in the Army and they did not have any, so they had to create them. But she was pregnant with me, so yay. Our journey with Southeastern, as now the Robertson family, ended physically, but it was always present in conversation. Every summer, looking like this, we would drive the 10 hours in our van from Nashville to Ponchatoula, and all the way, they would talk about Friendship Oak and Pottle and Southeastern. I feel like I knew so much about Southeastern. I did not want to come to this school. I didn't want to hear anything about it. Every summer, we would always hear the same stories about Southeastern and how they met and about their time. Also, I have an Uncle George. He ran track for Southeastern. He was recruited to run track from Ghana. And that's him holding me. And my Uncle George would tell me stories. My Uncle George obtained a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science with a minor in math. Now, you can imagine in the 1980s, a black man from Ghana in computer science and mathematics in South Louisiana was not really the norm. And he would always tell this story of how in one of his classes, he took a test and the teacher didn't believe that he actually passed the test because, spoiler alert, he made a really great grade. So they went back and forth, and of course, you know, it's the teacher. He's going to win the argument. So he made my Uncle George retake the test, to which he did better the second time than he did the first time. These were the stories of Southeastern that me and my sisters heard growing up. Now, also what was happening at Southeastern was that in 1981, Southeastern enters its first consent decree, first of many. Under this consent decree, there's a lot of information that's not applicable to Southeastern. Specifically, it has to do with Southern and Grambling and what they have to do. But what does have to do with Southeastern is that they have to increase the number of other race students. They have to have retention of open admissions for the duration of the consent decree. Other race recruitment plans on the campus are required, increased funding for developmental programs, scholarships for black students, an employment application clearinghouse to promote the increase of black faculty and professional staff employment on the campuses, and faculty development programs specifically geared to ensuring that if you hire them, that your black faculty and staff can be successful. Of course, there's legal fights. Of course, folks don't want to comply. And so this consent decree is essentially litigated until 1987, where Louisiana, Southeastern is part of the Louisiana schools that are in the consent decree. Louisiana outright defies and says, we're not sending you the information. We're just not doing it. They say we're not doing it. And so they update the consent decree. And the updated consent decree says now you must adopt open and non-discriminatory admission policies, and they must be explicit and not vague. The tactic of compliance to these consent decrees was to make the language so complicated and so ambiguous that it would take 1,400 degrees, to which most black people did not have, to understand what was actually required of them to get in. And so the revision of the consent decree said you got to clean up that language, you got to make it plain. In 1988, we also have our first Miss Black Southeastern, Joanne Williams, and there is a brief account of that. A student in 2019 wrote a blog post about a woman named Chantel Johnson, who worked as a janitor at the time in the 80s, who recalled Miss Williams winning. She says, it wasn't just the black campus community that was happy, but it was a lot of other cultural groups and ethnicities that were happy and excited as well. She said it gave them hope that one day their racial backgrounds could be accepted into the Miss Southeastern pageant because of Miss Joanne Williams winning. So now we move into the 1990s. So in the 1990s, a lot's happening in the world. We open the 1990s with Latasha Harlins in New York being shot by the Vietnamese women, to which, starts this conversation around the shooting of unarmed black persons in America, only to be followed weeks later by the footage of Rodney King being released, only to be followed by the Clarence Hill and the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas case and all of that, and then ending 1996 with the soap opera that was O.J. Simpson. If the glove don't fit, you must acquit. So all of this is happening in the background as it relates to black people in America. But also we are having some wins. Several first black mayors come into play in the 1990s. We have our first black Surgeon General. We have Nobel Peace Prize winners. We have Pulitzer Prize winners. In 1999, Serena Williams wins the US Open. So even in the midst of us seeing black pain and riots and violence, we are making gains. And it is similar for Southeastern. Southeastern in some ways is operating in a microcosm of this. For the Lowe family, my parents have kid number 6 and number 7. So Melissa and Deanna enter into the picture. My kids laugh at this. They say we look like a 90s sitcom. So my parents are now firmly entrenched in Nashville, Tennessee. We're all in school. My father is an associate pastor and doing work in the community. My mother volunteers at school, but is also raising 7 children. But we are in Nashville. And at this time, at the beginning of the 1990s, not really thinking about how we're going to end up back in Louisiana. In terms of what's happening with the litigation and the consent decrees, series of court cases bring us to the settlement agreement of 1994. Now, this is a consent decree. If you have been working at Southeastern for a really long time, you probably know this consent decree, because this is the consent decree that, one, said that you cannot have degrees that are the same within the same proximity. And I remember my department head, now dean, who hired me, talking about the history of the organizational communication program, to which she said it had to be organizational communication because LSU and some other schools near us had similar programs. That's because of the consent decree. That was in compliance with the consent decree. The consent decree also earmarked specific funding. It took the 1980 consent decree a step further and said you must provide funding and you must provide monitoring towards the real and meaningful desegregation and integration of these schools, or you will lose your funding. Also in the 1990s, we have President Clausen comes into the presidency, and working under President Clausen as the interim vice president of student affairs and executive assistant for the president is one Dr. Kim Hunter-Reid, who is now our commissioner of higher education. And under this administration, you see Southeastern actually gaining some wins and notoriety for its diversity efforts. Clausen wins an award, Hunter-Reid wins an award. We see in 1998, you have your first diversity week. In the late 90s, a diversity committee is formed on behalf of the president. You see faculty start to engage in, specifically in the College of Education, thanks to one Selena Eccles. You see work towards multicultural education, multiculturalism, not just confining it to one department, but offering opportunities for all to come in. You see Amilas Love begin to create specific spaces for multicultural affairs. So by the time we get to the 2000s, which is my era that I was in school, we're burgeoning. In terms of activity, in terms of involvement of black folks on campus, all of that work coalesces in the early 2000s. In 2001, one Eric Summers comes in as the director of multicultural affairs. Also, we have the one and only to date black dean, although he was interim and associate, Dr. Al Doucette, is also very integral in campus politics. In 2002, the African American Alumni Charter occurs, and we see just a renaissance of black activity. It is also during this time that we have our first black SGA president, and we also start to see the makeup of the homecoming court change a little bit. We start to see a little bit more diversity, not just in black spaces, but in Southeastern spaces. I start my journey in 2001 and end in 2006. My sister Stephanie starts her journey at the same time and essentially ends at the same time. Both of us graduate with bachelor's degree. I graduate with a master's. In 2003 to 2007, my sister Sarah is here. She graduates with a bachelor's. In 2005 to 2009, my sister Cheryl graduates with a general business degree with a minor in business administration. She also wins Orientation Leader of the Year. And in 2006 to 2010, my sister Michelle graduates with a social work degree while working at the rec and was instrumental in starting Rec Kids Childcare. That happened under her tenure. So all of this, and when I ask my sisters about what they recollect about their time at Southeastern, they say, I know in my classes I was the only one, but on campus I felt like I was part of a community. They all say as I got higher up in my classes and in my degree, there were fewer and fewer folks that looked like me in my class. But everywhere I looked, there were black people. There were black people in student government. There were black people in the band. There were black people in the choirs. There were black people on athletics teams. There were black people in the clubs. The stronghold was that we weren't seeing that same black attainment matriculate up into these specific majors. Most of the black retention was happening in general studies. So then we moved to 2010 to 2019. During this time, I'm working at Southeastern at this point. I've been working at Southeastern for a couple of years. This is a picture of my first graduate class I ever taught. There were only 5 women in the class, so I had to completely scrap my plan. And what we did was spend the semester talking to people about race and diversity on campus. And the conclusion of that was that those 5 women, or 4 of them, which are pictured here, presented our findings to Dr. Golding and Dr. Summers, at that point, the recommendation from that audit was that there needed to be more strategic and intentional efforts related to diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus. In this era, my 2 baby sisters were at Southeastern. So my sister Melissa actually has 2 degrees from Southeastern. She was at Southeastern from 2009 to 2013, and she got a general studies degree. Then she came back in 2015 and graduated in 2017 with a BA in visual art and design with a concentration in new media. At the time, she was a cartoonist in the Lion's Roar, and she talks about, because if you remember what was happening nationally, we were dealing with and reckoning with Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, the Charleston church shooting. So as the nation was grappling, Southeastern was grappling, and often this grappling played out in newspaper op-eds. And often my sister was called upon to create illustrations for these op-eds, which was a very taxing experience because nobody was really talking about race anymore. We were all dealing with race, but we weren't talking about race. My sister Deanna, my baby sister, was the final to graduate. She graduated in 2015 with a degree in psychology. And then ended up working for the next 3 years in the Office of Admissions. She was an orientation leader, and she talks about, once again, reiterating the fact, in her gen ed courses full of black people, as she got into her upper level psych classes, she was the first fewer only.
Robertson will receive a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology. Deanna's parents both earned degrees here at Southeastern, and her 6 sisters have all earned degrees in Southeastern. One of them is currently a faculty. What a great Southeastern family legacy.
My sister was determined that Dr. Crane was going to give her a shout out when she crossed the stage. That's the audio of it. She made sure to send to everyone who knew that she was number 7 graduating from the family. And she was like, I'm not leaving unless he says something. So that was an audio clip of that. In 2016, I graduated with a PhD from Regent University while teaching full-time, and also in 2016, I delivered my 7th child. That picture is of my grandmother, who rarely leaves her home on Sisters Road, coming to the house to not only congratulate me on the healthy delivery of my baby boy, but on being Dr. Elizabeth Robertson Hornsby. This picture, because I didn't walk at my graduation because I was not going to travel with 7 children and a newborn to Virginia to walk, showcases my family's legacy at Southeastern. It is my mother and my sister and my daughter, who is the next phase of the story, included. So in 2019, that little girl looked like that. Well, in 2001, that little girl looked like that when I started Southeastern. In 2019, she entered Southeastern as an undergraduate. Loriana Faith Robertson, the reason why I'm here is not only the promise of my dream, but she's the promise fulfilled of my parents' dreams and of my grandmother's dreams. And to see her be able to enter a Southeastern that looked very different from the Southeastern that her great-grandmother entered, I can't even express the words. Another significant thing, though, happened in 2019. In 2019, I was officially hired as an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Media Studies, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm the first Black assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Media Studies. And if I tenure, I would be the first. So all these years later, as we are entering into a 2020, and we all know what happened in 2020, COVID, George Floyd, political and social unrest, some pretty interesting and cool things happened in the 2020 era. So in 2021, Dr. Crane officially formed the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Council, which is a standing committee. We never had a standing committee. We had committees go in and out. We had grassroots organization. He formed a committee. 2020 was a lot. And so in the spirit of storytelling, I created a video that basically is just sharing some of the words that I wrote during this time period that really encapsulated not only my journey as a Southeastern student and faculty member, but also the journey of the shoes that I walk in. So that's a QR code. I'll go back to it later. Also in 2020, the SLU honors the Black Greek Letter Organization. The plots are outside. And then a highlight, which really, you can see me and my colleagues' faces. We finally see the dedication of the forthcoming Robin Roberts building, which also is very historic when you know the history that all that sits in. So why does this matter? Why does this matter? Because oftentimes history, more specifically Black history, is segmented out of and decoupled from the dominant narrative. It is seen as an other. It is in another month. It is seen as separate. And while we should absolutely highlight and celebrate the achievements of Black Americans, and specifically Black people who did a lot of work to get Southeastern to where it is today, the danger of singling out that story is that it's easy to forget about. And so what I tried to do in the last 50 minutes was to reconnect my history, my grandmother's history, Black history at Southeastern with Southeastern's history. Because I wouldn't be here if it weren't for them. A lot of you wouldn't be here if it weren't for them. But the bigger question is what happens now? What we know. What we know. What we know historically, what we know in the present day. We know that anytime progress is made, there are forces at work to not only eradicate that progress, but to set it back. We're already seeing those things. To the left and to the right of us in states, there is legislation that would literally prohibit conversations like this happening without fear of retaliation or termination. There are people who believe that to highlight a history, to celebrate and or to discuss anything that is of difference is divisive. And what I have to say is that how do you look someone in the face who is here, even though the mission of the institution was not to educate them, and yet and still they rise. And they come and they oversee and they say, your story is not valuable. Last night I was able to take part of a panel with a student organization, and there were a lot of really hard questions. One of the things I said, and I want to leave you with this today, about blackness and protecting your blackness, it's not just about celebrating who you are. It's about connecting who you are with the people around you. Because I can celebrate me all day. I don't need you to celebrate me. But if I keep all the things that I bring with me, the 70 decades of Southeastern history that I bring with me, if I keep that to me, then you miss the opportunity, you miss the opportunity, you miss the opportunity to understand and know. And then the work of those 12 brave young women, my grandmother included, is in vain. The goal was never to isolate and to separate. The goal was to connect. Inclusion is not a bad word. Diversity is not a bad word. Equity is not a bad word. These are words that help us fully actualize and walk out the promise of America. I am Black history. You're Black history. You're Black history. We're all Black history because Black history is history. Black Southeastern history is Southeastern history. So I hope today you are provoked. Not provoked to anger, but provoked to thought. I hope you think. If you feel something, think. And beyond think, look. And beyond look, learn. And beyond learn, ask. And beyond ask, do. Because change is relational, rarely immediate. Thank you.